And now for our first panel discussion on the blasphemy laws in Egypt will be moderated by Mr. Raymond Ibrahim. Joining Mr. Ibrahim will be Sean Nelson from the Alliance Defending Freedom, Ambassador Alberto Fernandez from Memory, and Brother Rashid. Let's welcome them up here.
Key points, but one of the most important ones, one which I actually think might resonate with Western audiences and people in America, is the blasphemy issue. Here, of course, it's not called blasphemy, but if you're familiar with what's going on in the current so-called cultural wars, there's a lot of censorship going on. If you have a certain opinion, if you have a certain belief, you get canceled, social media and so forth, you lose your job. So it's interesting to me to see that there's actually a rise in this sort of behavior, which is, of course, freedom of speech is the cornerstone of freedom, to be honest with you, because you can't speak, you can't communicate your thoughts, then where is your freedom? So in Egypt, we refer to it colloquially as blasphemy laws. Technically in Arabic it's called ازدراء, which means insulting or denigrating religions. And it's codified, of course, in the Egyptian law. And notice that the term Adyan, or religions, is plural. So it's meant to formally and officially protect Christianity and Judaism and Islam, the religions of the book, in Egypt. In reality and practically speaking, it tends to be only protecting one religion, the majority religion in Egypt. And it's used and it's abused. I mean, a lot of people talk about how blasphemy laws are abused. Of course, in their own essence, they're intrinsically abusive in nature. But in Pakistan, and I agree with Maggie that probably after Pakistan, which is notorious and horrible when it comes to this blasphemy issue, and so many Christians and Hindus and secular Muslims in Pakistan have been imprisoned and beaten, and others, of course, killed by the mob, for example, in Pakistan. A couple were burned alive, Christian couples, because some Quran was found burned, they couldn't even trace it to them. And when the woman wouldn't catch fire and she was pregnant, they actually added more flame, and then they put her in a kiln, basically a baking oven, to kill her. So that's the sort of passions involved in this particular topic. In Egypt, it doesn't usually get that bad, but it gets close. And you have mobs rise up when they hear something and so forth, and violence. And people get arrested, and as I said, it's usually used against the minority, the Christian Copts. And again, and this traces back in a way to Islamic law, because it's not a matter of he said, she said. Someone accuses a Copt of blasphemy, and the Copt says, no, I didn't. Again, in Islamic law, there's this idea that the Muslim is more trustworthy than the non-Muslim, and that whether it's stated or not comes into play. And I think it's also important to emphasize that in the laws of Egypt, they sound fair, but of course, we've seen they're not exercised or implemented the way they should be. And it's almost like a secret understanding between everyone in the Egyptian society, from the highest echelons of the government to the populace. So that's really the kernel of it all, and as we'll see, a lot of it traces back, and it's not just a modern phenomenon, it's historical, it's been going on for over a millennium. And I think that's the ultimate problem. This isn't some new thing, it's not temporal, it's not necessarily easily fixed, but it's something that's sort of ingrained in that society. So we have three excellent panelists, and I'll introduce them. I'll introduce them separately, and each one will come up and give us about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a quick Q&A. That's time for this. The first panelist is Sean Nelson, Legal Counsel of Global Religious Freedom, ADF International. Mr. Nelson serves as Legal Counsel for Global Religious Freedom, ADF International, where he advocates on behalf of Christians and other religious minorities being persecuted for their faith around the world, and particularly in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. In his role, he supports ADF International's allied lawyer network who represent clients facing significant violations of religious freedom. Based in D.C., he engages with various government actors, international institutions, and other organizations to coordinate efforts to promote religious freedom worldwide. and writes frequently on this topic. Please join me in welcoming Sean Elton.
Thank you for the introduction, and it's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be here in person with Coptic Solidarity and this fantastic panel. I'm going to be focusing, I think, primarily on how I view the legal and social framework for the blasphemy law in Egypt, and I'll mention a few cases towards the end, but I expect my co-panelists will be able to go into much greater particulars and historical detail. As was mentioned, I'm legal counsel for our Global Religious Freedom team at ADF International. ADF International is a faith-based legal international organization based in Vienna, Austria. We have offices throughout the world, thousands of allied lawyers who are in every continent focusing on religious freedom cases. And we work to protect fundamental freedoms for everybody. And one of the most fundamental ones that you can get is religious freedom. And that's what my team works on and what I work on, which is religious freedom issues in a lot of the most difficult countries for Christians, for other religious minorities to live in. That's usually going to be in the Middle East, in North Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and throughout Asia. For this panel, for thinking about blasphemy laws, getting rid of blasphemy laws is one of sort of our core priorities wherever they are around the world. And as was mentioned, it's something that's very often used to silence religious minorities, silence political dissent, to settle scores, just to scapegoat people. And so we really want to see these things taken down wherever they are. And when I was first invited to be on this panel, I think there was a question about apostasy laws as well. And so I kind of want to just talk a little bit more broadly about apostasy and blasphemy laws and how they really violate the core rights of religious freedom. When we think about what are the core things that religious freedom are what is that meant to protect? We think of the right to choose your religion, choose your beliefs, or to not have them at all, right? That's one of the most fundamental things. That's what we see in international documents. We're talking about the right to freedom of worship, to be able to safely go to whatever house of worship you would like to go to without worrying about interference. We're talking about the right to live out your faith, to be identified publicly with your faith so that you're not attacked. And we're talking about the right to be able to share and talk about your faith, which, as was mentioned, involves the freedom of expression. In fact, religious freedom is intimately tied up with all sorts of other fundamental and core freedoms: freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of the press, so that people can know what's going on. And so when we look at apostasy laws and blasphemy laws in general, they are some of the most potent tools of governments and people who would wish to persecute religious minorities in terms of attacking some of those very core fundamental aspects of religious freedom. So for apostasy laws, what does that attack? That attacks the ability to be a particular member of a religion, to change your religion, to determine that for yourself. And so we see there's kind of a scale for all of these things, right? On the one side, you'd have the most open version, which is there are no restrictions, right? You don't have to tell the government when you're going to change your religion. You don't have to tell them what religion you are. You can choose to adopt or not have a religion. That's going to be the most open version of that. The most closed version of that is what we see, unfortunately, in a handful of countries around the world, which are where you can't change your religion. And in particular, nowadays, historically this wasn't always the case, but nowadays you're primarily going to see that in Muslim-majority countries as a function of a certain interpretation of Sharia law, which is that if you are converting outside of Islam to another religion, or if you are stating something that the way these laws say is you're committing an act that's functional, similar to apostasy, then you could face severe consequences and even death. right? So that's sort of the spectrum of things, right? The most restrictive versus the least restrictive. Now in Egypt, there is no formal apostasy law. You will not be, in the law, you can't be charged with apostasy. You won't be, if you try to convert, you're not going to go to jail, in theory, for that. However, that doesn't mean that we're in the free zone here, right? There are many other laws that make it difficult for people to convert, in particular, away from Islam. But there are also practices that prevent people from doing that, right? You are supposed to be able to freely convert away from Islam or towards any other religion that's at least recognized. But that's not how it really works. If you're converting towards Islam, there's no problem whatsoever. If you're converting away from Islam, you have issues with trying to get your ID cards changed. You may have issues with personal and marital laws. You're going to have lots of social and coercive pressures. We've been contacted by people who, this is unfortunately a common thing throughout the Middle East, where they are convert away from Islam, their family or their friends find out, and they are basically imprisoned in their own houses and prevented from doing almost anything because it's viewed as so shameful, or they may be threatened, their life may be threatened. So even though the law is there in terms of there is no apostasy law, there still are legal pressures, and then there are social pressures for that. When it comes to the blasphemy law in Egypt, again, we can think about this on a spectrum. What's the most free one, right? Freedom of expression completely recognized. You are allowed to say what you would like about your religious beliefs, allowed to share what those are, allowed to persuade other people that they should share your beliefs. You're allowed to criticize other beliefs, or at least just discuss them. You're allowed to do all of those things. That's sort of the most open version of that. The most closed version, again, we see this unfortunately in a few countries, is where you're not allowed to do any of that. If you try to do that, in some countries you can face the death penalty. In more countries than that, you can face legal sanctions. And again, usually for the ones that are the most restrictive, those are going to be statements that either insult the Prophet Muhammad or denigrate Islam or a doctrine of Islam. At least that's the case now. Historically, again, that applied to lots of different religions in different countries. Right now, that's where it is. Egypt is closer to that bad end. It's not the furthest that you could be, but it is far from the ideal of freedom of expression. And so I want to think about this blasphemy law. It's not merely a religious offense law, and I'll go through the specific language of it. But it incorporates national security concerns, national unity concerns, and I think that kind of framing is really good for understanding the kind of authoritarian way of managing religious groups and religious minority groups that you see in Egypt and that you see in some other countries. The blasphemy law should be understood as just one of a number of tools that the government uses to kind of manage different minority groups, manages political opinions, manages those different aspects of things. And when I say it's not just a religious offense law, as was mentioned, the law itself talks about the three recognized, the heavenly religions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. In practice, it is used to protect Islam. And of course, it doesn't actually get applied towards any other religion, whether it's recognized or not recognized. And so I want to talk about the specific wording of it, because I think it's a very interesting wording. So the actual law is in the Egyptian Penal Code. It's Article 98F. There are a number of other laws that restrict speech in different aspects, but this is the specific one when people are talking about the blasphemy law. And the language is detention for a period of not less than 6 months and not exceeding 5 years, or you could pay a fine. That's the penalty inflicted on anybody who exploits and uses religion in advocating and propagating by talk or in writing or by any other method extremist thoughts with the aim of instigating sedition and division, or disdaining and contempting any of the heavenly religions or the sects belonging thereto, or prejudicing national unity or social peace. And so the one, as you can see, that's an interesting collection of words there that can be expanded to, like a balloon, can go to kind of any size, right? You could, one of the key words there is extremist thought, right? So in one way, the law is defended, and similar laws are defended on national security grounds. This is really about violent extremism. That's what we're trying to get. That's what we're trying to stop. That's what we're trying to limit. And we think that by having that law, that makes it in comport with international obligations, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or any other kind of agreements, right? And if that were the case, if there were any other things that defined extremism in the law, saying, no, we're just talking about violent extremism and people who are about to commit terror and things like that, then fine, none of us would be here talking about this, right? But that's not what it's actually used for. And as you see, as you go through the list of different things that the extremist thought is connected to, you can see just how expansive, like the balloon, just how expansive this definition could be, right? Instigating sedition and division. What does that mean, right? Does that mean that you have joined a militia group, that you are promoting them? Or, then you have the question, what's a militia group? Or does it mean that you are disagreeing with the authorities in a way that they're concerned might reveal something bad about them, or might reveal something critical about them? And that's what we see this getting used for, is this sense that the government is always worried that there is going to be, if there's any hint of criticism or problems or things like that, that somehow destroys national unity, right? Rather than allowing people to freely talk and discuss and improve things, which is another way of viewing national unity, which is a positive way of viewing it. The idea is that if you discuss things, then that can cause agreements or disagreements. Disagreements can cause violence, and then the whole government and everything falls down, right? And so you have this very restrictive view there. Disdaining and contempting any of the heavenly religions. Again, it's interesting that this is focused in theory on the Abrahamic faith rather than any other faith. But in practice, it's primarily about disdaining and contempting Islam. But those words as well are very, very pliable and flexible. Merely stating your belief about something, sharing your opinion, which is, again, a core internationally recognized right, that to somebody could be disdain and contempt. And if you're looking at it through this lens of national unity, where disagreement, dissent, anything like that can upset the social fabric, then you're going to start finding contempt and disdain in smaller and smaller places, and in places that don't look like they have many connections. And so that's what we see, and I'll try to briefly just go through a list of this, but I think when you look at the different kinds of cases that this law and other laws are applied to, you're not seeing this being applied to violent extremism. You're not seeing it being applied even to people about to get into a fight or anything like that. You're seeing it getting applied to a wide range of religious and religiously inflected political speech, advocacy, especially in human rights advocacy, and in journalism. And so from 2014 to 2018, USCIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, they reported that 44 out of the over 600 blasphemy cases in the world were in Egypt, right? Which means Egypt itself accounts for just a little bit under 10% from that period alone. So this is a law that is significantly used. It gets kind of added on to a lot of other laws as well. I'll go through some of these cases just very briefly because I know I'm running out of time. But in 2018, there was a conviction of a Coptic Christian, Abdo Adel, for a Facebook post comparing Jesus to the Prophet Muhammad. After his arrest, there was mob violence against the Copts there in the community and their homes. 90 rioters were arrested, but most of them were released in a community reconciliation session, right? And so all the things that people are going to be talking about today, they all work together to marginalize the Coptic Christian community, to marginalize religious minority voices, and to basically dissuade people from saying anything that looks like it's out of bounds. In 2015, half of the blasphemy cases targeted Christians. In very, very recent years, which is to say 2021, it does seem like there was a slight dip in arrests and convictions, but it's whether you think that's a trend or not, I would be very surprised if it's a trend. I think we're seeing more blasphemy arrests and convictions in the region generally, but it'll be interesting to see. At the same time, there have definitely been some notable ones recently. Ahmed Abdu Mar, he was a lawyer and a writer. He was sentenced to 5 years under this law in November 2021 for criticizing some Islamic jurisprudence and some jurisprudence and various Islamic wars throughout history. So for that, again, that challenges certain authorities who are allowed to speak, and so he needed to be silenced for that. Atheist Anas Hanan, he was sentenced to 3 years in 2020 for his participation in an Egyptian atheist Facebook page. So just having that out there saying this is a group that exists, here's what we believe, that can be enough. In November 2020, there was a prosecution of Christian Youssef Hani for alleged insults to the Prophet Muhammad in a social media argument. They prosecuted him, but they did not prosecute the person he was responding to who was insulting Christianity, right? So you see in a very clear case that this is not used. There's been other people who have been held in jail past their what were supposed to be the release dates, allegedly for their own safety. And I just wonder how those folks felt about being held in jail for their own safety, rather than arresting the people threatening them. The law is also used to police morality, which is kind of a strange thing because the law doesn't seem to target morality, and it's supposed to target extremism, not morality. And so Christian Marco Girgis was sentenced to 5 years earlier this year under the blasphemy law. It's really kind of unclear what he did, but some news reports say that he allegedly had some kind of sexually interesting, I don't even know, material on his phone, which that doesn't seem to be advocating and propagating extremist material, and yet that was viewed as disdaining Islam. One of the positive things from this year, there were a number of human rights reporters who were released after lengthy detentions, although I think their status is still up in the air for how those cases are going to go. And as was mentioned, when cases get international attention, then we'll respond after a year or two of pushing on that. But for everybody else, if they don't get the limelight, if they don't get USERF or the UN to say something, we just forget about them. And again, it goes to this idea that we want to push anything that's critical of the government under the rug, and only if it gets brought out by a lot of people will we do something. So that was Rami Kamel. He was a Coptic a journalist, talked about, Coptic journalist, talked about the abuse, a lot of human rights abuses, including towards Coptic Christians, and Patrick Zaki. There's also a Quranist, which is a sort of Islamic sect, Reda Abdel Rahman, who was also released. So we will see if this is a trend. I, for one, am skeptical that it's a trend. But I think this viewing the use of not just this blasphemy law, but all the other kind of national security laws through this sense of a government deeply concerned with, in a way, kind of its own fragility, right? Deeply concerned that dissent or just conversation or anything that seems to mark difference amongst peoples, that can lead to big social problems and problems for the government, really helps explain some of the lack of progress on these kind of laws, or lack of progress when it comes to combating violence, versus some of the more ostentatious improvements, like with the building of the large cathedral in Cairo, or the documents signed with the Pope, right? Those kind of things are places where you're incorporating people into this sense of national unity. Look, this is a group that's part of us, and we're going to celebrate that. And you don't have to get into any conversations about any controversial things, even if they're not really controversial, but things that might be viewed that way. But when it comes to actually people being able to state their particular beliefs, people being able to have those conversations, people being able to report on failures of the government, anything that challenges the authority of any of the recognized religious authorities or the government, that's where we're not seeing improvement, right? We're seeing improvement on those things that look like, yes, we're building up national unity. We're not seeing things on those other areas. And so that does leave you with the sense that if you're a Copt, then you're worried, is an argument going to turn into something where I could be thrown into jail the next day? Is an argument going to turn into something where my community is going to be attacked? Is me stating my beliefs about something going to lead to disaster? So that's my overview of how I view things. So thank you.
Thank you for that. You said a lot, which is important. Keep in mind that one thing that came to my mind, which I think needs some elaboration, is the point that you mentioned where oftentimes these apostasy laws are not worded in the classic definition used left Islam or whatever the case may be, and therefore the enemy. They're couched in really national language and security language. So basically, for example, this is commonly, especially in Iran, where most of the Iranians are born Muslim, as most Muslims are, and if they convert, it's not necessarily the apostasy law that gets them, but it's because by converting, you're now sort of seen as a dissident. You're not part of the group, and it really shows you how when you boil it down, it comes down to very tribalistic thinking, because it's not the Western understanding of religion, which is okay. We all live under civic rule, and we can all have our own individual religious beliefs. So in this case, the mainstream religion of Egypt and Iran is also seen as a sort of, part of being a national. And if you're not that, and you don't agree with us, then you're out of the tribe, and you're seen as a security threat. It's not just because you're a Christian. Now you must actively be working to undermine society. And I think that's very interesting, because it really is one of the main underpinnings of especially the apostasy law. At any rate, thank you, Mr. Nelson. Our next speaker is Ambassador Alberto N. Fernandez. He's the Vice President of the Middle Eastern Media Research Institute, also known as MEMRI, and a member of the Board of Directors of the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security at George Washington University. He's also a non-resident fellow in the Middle East Politics and Media at the Trends Research and Advisory Center in Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. And he has a very long biography and CV. Anyone interested, I encourage you to look him up. So without any further ado, Mr. Fernandez.
Thank you. I was trying to think what I could say that would not be the same as Sean and others have said. And I thought that I would talk about, I think, an underexplored aspect of the problem, which is kind of the national security aspect of the issue. In 2017, I was appointed head of Middle East Broadcasting Networks, which includes Al Hurra Television. And I was surprised in late 2017 to be the subject of a fierce campaign inside Egypt of repeated media attacks across a wide variety of media outlets, because we hadn't done anything about Egypt or towards Egypt, and there was no policy reason. But it was a very intense campaign, and it was, kind of political and personal as well. It didn't make much sense on the surface. I remember a sympathetic Egyptian journalist passed me a copy of the talking points that media outlets were provided by Egyptian intelligence, because Egyptian intelligence largely controls the media, including the private media in Egypt. And the real fear seemed to be not that Al-Hurra was going to be pro-Islamist, but somehow that it would be a space for criticism of the regime that was not Islamist, that was secular or liberal or whatever, and that so that the outlet needed to be kind of discredited. I was thinking about that because when we talk about blasphemy, when we talk about apostasy, there's a world of difference between what is written down, what is written, say, in the Egyptian constitution, and how policy is actually implemented by the state, particularly by the national security state, which is the arbiter of almost all power inside Egypt. And even though Egypt is, say, an authoritarian regime, if I can use that, it does need the military, the security services, do need some sort of political buy-in, either real or feigned, to compensate for whatever can come up that will be unpopular, whether to say these are unpopular economic or political decisions, questions of corruption, decision of, say, surrendering islands to Saudi Arabia, anything that could kind of make people unhappy. So the state, even though it's not, say, a pure democracy, is conscious of public opinion, is conscious of the way people feel or how people see things. Authority over morality, over questions of faith, over blasphemy, over apostasy, over orthodoxy, is real power. It is power to distract, power to cow, but also power to present one's institution as the ultimate guardian of the country's spiritual and ideological well-being. So it becomes a power, and this power becomes a source of legitimacy. We've seen it many times where we see rulers in the Arab and Muslim worlds embrace Islam or embrace Islamism to kind of reinvent themselves. Sadat himself buried Nasserism in the 1970s by allowing 100 different flowers of Islamism to bloom. Some of those flowers, of course, killed him a decade later. In Sudan, we saw Jafar al-Numeri start as a communist and a Nasserist and end as an Islamist, executing people for apostasy, including, by the way, Mahmoud Mohammed Taha, who was executed for apostasy after the Egyptian government got permission from Al-Azhar to do so. Al-Azhar telling the Islamist regime in Sudan, yes, Mahmoud Mohammed Taha, the Sudanese reformer, this man is indeed an apostate, he can be killed. We saw this, for example, with Saddam Hussein and his Islam campaign, which gave space for Islamists, including a zealous university student who later became known as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. This is Ba'athist Saddam Hussein creating space for Islamism. So the power to punish apostasy, the power to punish blasphemy, is a national security power. It is a political, you could say, a power which has real teeth for the state. It's not so much, of course, Christians are being singled out. Of course, Christians are being persecuted. But the reason for it has to do with an essential part of what the state's very nature. It is a state that wants to keep control and stay in power. So the state can, at the same time, embrace and highlight nationalism, promote a narrative of Coptic Muslim unity, while simultaneously preserve for itself this terrible power to demonize any citizen over perceived moral or spiritual transgressions. It's a double-edged sword, but one that allows the state to use with alacrity. They can persecute for blasphemy Coptic Christians, liberal Muslims. They can tighten the screw. They can loosen the screw. All of this happening under supposedly anti-Islamist government of President Assisi. In 2021, for example, we had the case of someone like researcher Dr. Ahmed Abdul Maher, a Muslim, who was persecuted for blasphemy, except he wasn't persecuted for blasphemy. He was persecuted under the national security law. And the government, and even though Abdul Maher was a former Egyptian general, and judge and general. He was a judge advocate in the army. Military judge. And a full supporter of the president. The state, the regime, allowed the process to go forward, to go through, until finally at the end, of course, given who he was, squashing and giving him mercy. But here you see the state allowing it to go forward as a kind of arbitrary tool that it can use against citizens, whoever they are. It's a great irony, in fact, that just as Saudi Arabia, which was for so many decades the generating motor of Islamism regionally and worldwide, and liberalizes with all the caveats that we should have when we talk about Saudi Arabia, and promotes a certain level of tolerance, Egypt is going in the opposite direction. In 2013, and even before, the decision was taken by the Egyptian authorities to prescribe certain types of political Islam while allowing others. So many Egyptians saw the 2013 overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood regime in the hopes that the military would uproot Islamism, naively perhaps. But what actually happened was the political isolation of a particular organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, coupled with a massive rise of Islamism, non-MB Islamism, and Salafism at the same time. As far as the culture is concerned, there were more freedoms in Egypt under Mubarak in the 1980s and 90s than seems today. And since the state doesn't actually promote liberalism or secularism, and actually allows the increasing Islamization of the public sphere, this makes the space the regime has to police and look over, the moral policing tiger that it has to ride, much more narrow, much more fraught. So it has to exercise more control, more zealotry for the sake of preserving itself and preserving the state. So the state allows activities and then doesn't allow them. It allows anti-Semitism and then punishes anti-Semitism. It allows anti-Americanism and then tightens the screws on anti-Americanism. It forgives and it punishes at the same time. Memory recently had a clip on the private Al-Hadath Al-Yom television station by host Mohammed Musa, where he talked about Freemasonry, Al-Masoniyya. And this masonry was about what? The protocols of the elders of Zion. He never used the word Jew or Judaism, but it was about how this Masoniyya was, what was it doing? It was the one that was spreading deviant art and corruption in society in Egypt, threatening Egypt. The word Jew was never used, but the implication was clear. I think that, while we hope that there will be changes in Articles 98F and 161 and 176 and 178 of the Penal Code, or the second article of the Constitution, or in the 1996 version of the Hizbullah, these are all things that are actually almost beside the point. The point is that the very arbitrary nature of implementation of all of these things by the state is a feature and not a bug of the system. Even if all these laws were modified or removed, the national security laws that allow all these things to happen would remain a sword of Damocles over the system. We often forget when we talk about political Islam and extremism that much of the Islamism and intolerance that we see in the region is not so much organic or revolutionary, but actually the result of state action, of states allowing it, of states using it as a tool, as a political tool. Just as, for example, Gulf states promoted the Muslim Brotherhood for many, many years, for decades, until they decided this is a really bad idea, we need to stop doing this. You see, for example, in the biography of the infamous Syrian jihadist, Abu Musab as-Suri, who began as a Muslim brother in Egypt and then was part of the terrorist faction of the Muslim Brotherhood, the revolutionary vanguards, when he flees Damascus in the 1980s, he temporarily finds refuge in Jordan, in Egypt, and in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. None of these states were Islamist states. None of them were Muslim Brotherhood regimes. Why did they provide him refuge, at least temporarily? Because their interests were against Ba'athist Syria. So it was a very kind of using this as a weapon and using this as a tool against adversary. Later on, for example, we saw the Assad regime do the same thing in 2003 when this supposedly anti-Islamist regime facilitated the move of thousands of jihadists into Iraq to kill Americans and to kill Iraqis. In Egypt, the current authorities allow and give important space, both physical and ideological, to Islamists, to Salafis, as long as they are ostensibly anti-Muslim Brotherhood. This is, to me, is the heart of the matter. The national security dimension of it, the need of the state to use, you could say, a non-Islamist version of al-amr bil-ma'ruf, al-amr bil-ma'ruf used by nationalists, not by Islamists, as a weapon and as a tool. So unfortunately, when it comes to criminalizing blasphemy, the tendency has been towards becoming more rather than less rooted in society. As the society is transformed and the regime seeks to please people to a certain extent. The authorities in Egypt are riding a blasphemy train that they cynically help create and feel that they can't get off. Thank you very much.
Since we're running out of time, we'll try to condense it all for the Q&A portion. Our next guest is, well, according to that plaque in front of it's named Ibrahim, but it's actually Brother Rashid. And Brother Rashid needs no introduction, especially to those in the Arab world. He's, as I call him, the most notorious apostate around. And he's actually quite the blasphemer, because on his weekly shows, where he dissects Islam, he naturally blasphemes according to the strict Islamist interpretation. He's definitely well placed to give us one of the best interpretations, because unlike what we've been hearing so far, which is very important with the underpinnings, it's all theoretical. He actually has lived it. He's from Morocco, left Islam, became a Christian. He can tell you more about his travels. And now he has, earlier he had the Arabic show, very popular, Su'al Gharib, which means daring question, where he examined problematic issues with Islam related to oftentimes these issues of apostasy and blasphemy. He now has a newer show, in all clarity, where he does much of the same thing, thankfully. Brother Rashid has a bachelor's degree in religious studies, so he even has some very good academic training, as well as an MA in political science. So a very wonderful package, and even despite being very busy with all of his media work, he's had time to write at least 2 or 3 books, one of which is The Future of Islam, and the other is ISIS and Islam, and they're written in both English and Arabic. Please welcome Brother Rashid.
Well, thank you. Blasphemy laws, they are not just a topic for me, they affected me personally, as Raymond shared. I left Morocco because I was under a threat to be arrested at any time because of those laws, and I had many visits from secret police so many times, taken and interrogated under blasphemy laws. In Morocco, they call it shaking the faith of a Muslim. They don't call it blasphemy laws. It's like if you talk to a Muslim and his faith is shaken After that conversation, you'll be arrested for that. And since I left Morocco, I cannot visit my home country because of those laws. If I visit Morocco, I'll be arrested at the airport. My brother was interrogated instead of me. My father, before he passed away, he was interrogated, and they asked them questions about me. I cannot visit any Arab Muslim country personally because I will be arrested for the same reason. If I go to Egypt, I think I will have one-way ticket, and I will not buy the other one. I have even a threat wherever I go. If I have a gathering more than a certain number of people, I always hire security guards, even in America and Europe. And that's also because there are many protectors of Islam around the world. So let's dig into the topic. Blasphemy laws are vague usually. They are not really precise, so you cannot tell exactly what blasphemy is and what is not. So they are vague. For example, what's included to be an Islamic symbol? If you criticize the Quran, you will be arrested. If you criticize Muhammad, you will be arrested. So where is the limit? If you criticize the wives of the Prophet, you will be arrested. If you criticize the companions of the Prophet, you will be arrested. And now even if you criticize al-Bukhari and Muslim, you will be arrested. And the list can go on and probably include even Sheikh al-Azhar, which like he's an Islamic figure now. If you criticize him, probably you will be arrested for that. Al-Azhar institution, for example, can be protected under the same term. So where is the limit? Where is the red line? There is no red line. Everybody can include everybody. So let's say you are a Shi'i living in Egypt and you don't respect Omar and Abu Bakr, for example, because for you, they just hijacked the authority from the family of the Prophet. If you criticize Abu Bakr and Omar in Egypt, you will be arrested for blasphemy. So even a Muslim Shi'i cannot really express himself clearly in Egypt. So the term is vague, and because it's vague, they can apply it to anybody at any moment for any reason. And this is one of the most dangerous things. It can be used by authorities against their enemies, their critics, their opponents, anybody they don't like. Also, the second thing about it, it's made to protect Islam, as many mentioned and shared. It's not made, even if it says religions, it doesn't include Christianity and Judaism and any other religion. It's just to protect Islam. This is one of the most problematic aspects of this law, because Islam in its holy texts, it criticizes other religions. It criticizes the pillars of Christianity, for example. It criticizes crucifixion. It criticizes divinity of Christ. And in response to that, a Christian living in Egypt cannot say anything. He can only defend his faith without mentioning Islam. So if he says, for example, I'm just giving an example, if he replies to another Muslim, I don't believe in the Quran. If the Muslims say Jesus was not crucified because the Quran says so and so, if the person replies and say, I don't believe in the Quran because it's not from God, he will be taken to jail for that. So it's not really, I'm not talking about fairness, about logic or anything. There is no logic in it, because Islam criticized Judaism, criticized Christianity, and it's recited, its holy texts are recited every day in mosques, and nobody can object or say anything, even when it concerns their own faith. The other thing, this law is made against Christians and former Muslims. Christians are silenced under this law. Many Christians were arrested just because sharing a message on social media. Even likes, if you like a post on Facebook that criticizes Islam, you can be arrested for that like. Personally, I have many people send me private messages on my social media. They say, we support you, but we cannot say it publicly, because if we do so, if we even click, even if we follow your page, we might be arrested for that. That means that they are living under fear and under, they are silenced, just to say the least. For former Muslims, they cannot say anything. Raif Badawi, for example, in Saudi Arabia, was arrested for 10 years. He was released recently, but he cannot leave the country for other 10 years. And he's just a clear example that even the reformed so-and-so Saudi Arabia cannot release a person because he posted 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago, he posted something on the internet concerning Islam. It hinders reformers. This law, it doesn't allow reformers to do anything concerning Islam. Ahmad Abdul Maher, we heard his name mentioned. He is a Muslim. He's not a former Muslim or a Christian or an atheist. He's still a Muslim, but he just want to reform Islam. He want to remove text from Bukhari and Muslim, and that's it. And he was threatened by this law for 5 years until they showed him mercy, as we heard at the last moment. So reformers as Islam al-Bahiri, for example, he was arrested under the same pretext that because of blasphemy laws. He was arrested for 1 year. He was released also to show him mercy by the president, I think, himself. And Islam Bahiri, as far as I know, he's still a Muslim defending Islam. He just have a different view of it. It is against free speech and human rights. So we are not, I am a former Muslim. I am an apostate, as Raymond said. I am an outspoken. I speak my mind. I use my right. I express myself without apologies, and I criticize Islam openly. I can't do that anywhere in the Muslim world. I cannot have that right anywhere. Unfortunately, even in the West, pages that speak Arabic or they have an Arabic version of it, I cannot publish an article because of politically correctness. The West and many other countries, many other platforms are appeasing Muslims by following what they dictate on blasphemy laws. Take any website, any Arabic website, I cannot say anything. So they are appeasing them, and they are actually encouraging them in a certain way to continue to have blasphemy laws. Nobody is challenging that. It spreads fear and division. Under the pretext of having unifying the society, actually, it spreads fear and division. Let me say the roots of this law are based on two things. We heard it is somehow an it's a security problem for the regime if they allow Islam to be criticized. It's a challenge to the authority of the rulers. But this blasphemy law has two roots, actually. One root is Islam itself, the text itself. Since the start of Islam, nobody was allowed to criticize Islam until today, for 1400 years. It has been applied, it has been practiced during the Caliphate, during the time of Muhammad, during the two caliphates, and even during the rest of the history, Islamic history. So it has a religious root. We cannot deny that, we cannot ignore it. Al-Azhar knows that, the sheikhs, the clerics, they know that. So the religious aspect of it is there. Every Muslim wants to protect Islam in a way, and they want, every regime, Islamic regime, want to protect Islam. But the other root of it is protecting authority itself. Because our regimes in the Middle East and North Africa, they use religion to govern. Religion is a powerful tool, is a power there. For example, in Morocco, the king claims that he's a descendant of the prophet. So if you challenge Islam, you're challenging his own authority. Even in Egypt, al-Sisi, even if he says he's just the president of Egypt, but in a way, he is the protector of Islam. And you can say the same thing about Saudi Arabia, about Jordan, about any Islamic country. They are supposed to protect Islam. If they do not do that, other Islamic groups will challenge their authority and they will govern instead of them. So they're in a dilemma as well. They don't know what to do, actually. If they don't do it, others will do it, and they will be popular among the people. So now, what is the solution? How we deal with blasphemy laws? One of the things, we have to expose them every time. We have to have media coverage. Usually we heard like 90% of the cases when more than 90%, the 1% gets the attention when it comes to Christians being persecuted, and the 99% will not get attention. The same thing applies when blasphemy laws. Many are, I just got a case in Morocco. A lady in Morocco was sentenced for, I think, 3 years, as I remember. 3 years for blasphemy against Islam, just for posting something on Facebook. Many cases are not covered in the whole Muslim world. So we need media attention. We need to cover these stories. We need to expose these laws. We need to give platforms for people who are expressing themselves and criticizing either Islam or trying to reform Islam. We need to give them platform because they don't have any in Muslim Arab countries. And thank you. And thank you, everybody.
Again, we got a very wonderful insight into all these issues. I'd like to just comment on something that you said and elaborate a little bit on to show you just how bad it is, in as much as it pertains to the Western world. The OIC, I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, it's called the Organization of Islamic Conference or Cooperation, which is almost every Muslim country part of it, and it has great influence on the international scene, the UN and so forth, is, as Brother Rashid said, trying to force even Western nations to adopt blasphemy law or versions thereof. And what I find ironic, again, and which Brother Rashid touched on, is if they actually, the United Nations or any institute in the Western world or in the world were to incorporate this, the very religion of Islam could be banned. Yeah. Because the entire religion of Islam is built on denigrating other religions. In the book, in the Quran, in the Hadith, Christians are attacked, the religion are attacked by name, Jews, same thing. No other religion does this. Christianity doesn't, the New Testament doesn't attack the Old Testament, it seems a continuation. Jews don't attack Christians because they precede them in time, but the Muslims come after them both, and within their actual holy book in the Quran, you have fight and kill the kafir, fight the people of the book, take the jizya from them, while they're feeling humble. Do not befriend the Jews and the Christians. They are their own friends. Whoever befriends them is like them, an infidel. Hates all non-Muslims, including Jews and Christians. So it's just amazing to me the irony that this entire religion is built on denigrating others, and they're going out of their way to insist that others respect religion. Okay, so with that, we'll take some questions. I think we're running out of time, so we'll try to be brief and as succinct as possible. Please, questions, not comments and observations.
Thank you for this presentation, which was very nice. As a matter of fact, blasphemy laws and applications are supported mainly in the environment that's supported mainly by the Azhar Institute. Do you know that the Azhar Institute has schools from kindergarten till universities? About 1/3 of the education system in Egypt is Azhar system, which makes the students from day one till they go up and get graduated, doesn't deal with any Christian in his life. In addition to the curriculum of this system, are full of hate principles against unbelievable, non-Islam. And so the environment of individuals who go out and come back to the society working as doctors, as engineers, as media, they are full of the principles of the hate principles full in the curriculum of the Azhar. And so supporting such an education system is the main source of feeding of the hate and all these kinds of blasphemy, accusation, and so on. And so we hope that this system could be changed. Otherwise, we will have a great Taliban system in Egypt one day. They are now hidden, but could be was at any moment, and come another Taliban worse than this of Afghanistan, because in Egypt was the source who teaches Taliban all over the world, and ISIS all over the world as well.
Thank you. Are there any questions? I actually have one quick question, observation to Mr. Nelson, if he actually knows, because it doesn't have to do with Egypt, but it's very applicable to apostasy and actually the Western nations. Are you familiar with? Is it your organization that I think was protecting a man who goes by the name of Hassan or HH, who was denied asylum in Germany?
Yeah, that was in Germany. That was about Hassan. He was an Iranian refugee or asylum.
Right.
Left there, went through Turkey, got UNHCR status, went to Germany. While he had been in Iran, he converted to Christianity.
Yeah.
Right, because his brother-in-law had actually been arrested and
Killed?
You're right. I think they said he committed suicide in prison, and you can believe what you want about that. And so both Hassan and his wife had converted. Then they were raided, and so he and his wife fled. So when they got to Germany, what was so incredible about that case, the German courts they questioned his sincerity for applying for asylum status by saying, well, if your brother-in-law had been persecuted, then why didn't you just shut up? That's what a normal person would do. That wouldn't inspire anybody. If you were a rational person, you would never find that interesting, right? And so I think there is this, increasing, unfortunately, skepticism and hostility and misunderstandings about what religious belief even is by many who are in power in the West, and that does enable a lot of bad actors around the world, including in Egypt, to be able to say, oh, we're just doing this because we have national security concerns. We're just doing this for this. There's no real persecution.
And to elaborate on it, some more details that I'm aware of. So basically, they did. So keep in mind, this is Germany, which took about 1.5 million Muslim majority migrants in 2015. Before Hassan applied in 2018. And then after he applied, they took in, I think, 15,000 unvetted Afghans. And Afghanistan and of course they're almost all Muslims. And Afghanistan is considered the most dangerous nation in the world towards Christians, which implies they may well share the Taliban worldview, these unvetted. But when it comes to this one man who's a Christian, they have to kick him out. And this is hardly the first. I follow this closely. There's a lot of people, Christians, women, blasphemers, Christians who leave, and they're the only ones. It happens a lot, especially in the United Kingdom with the Home Office. And the same thing, they told him basically they didn't believe his story that he converted, because how would he convert or even remain a Christian having seen what happened to his brother-in-law? And obviously that kind of thinking completely misunderstands the whole of early Christian history, which is about, my beliefs are more important than dying. So it completely misses that. And but beyond that, in the UK, in the Home Office, they've done the same thing where Christian apostates from the Muslim world come and apply. And one woman, actually, they told her, your faith in Jesus, we don't believe you, because if you really believed in him, then he could save you from your Iranian captors. So we think your whole story is bogus. And another man was told, he said he had left Islam because he found Christianity to be more peaceful. And the Home Office denied him and said, well, and they actually quoted excerpts from Exodus, from the Bible, Leviticus and Exodus, and even the New Testament, Revelation, said, look, there's a lot of violence here. Therefore, when you say you converted to Christianity because Islam was violent, we don't believe you, deny. So that sort of thing, it's important, and this is how visible it is. As bad as it is in the Islamic world, there's very little succor or appreciation for it, if not worse, coming from Western elements.
I've actually personally heard that question come from asylum officers myself. I represent a lot of asylums fleeing Egypt, and some of which are converts. And I've heard the question myself, why would you do something so dangerous? It doesn't make any sense. It must be a lie. In knowing that you could die, why would you do that? I remember one particular officer questioned a woman who was a convert, and this woman was just so committed. She exits Egypt in the airport wearing a cross. And the officer stops her and says, what are you doing? And then, I think she said something like, it's jewelry or whatever, and he let her through. So the asylum officer says, wait a minute, you barely got out. You went on your way out? It just doesn't make any sense. But yeah, they just can't process, that choice. It's a personal choice.
And it's
and some people are willing to die for it.
Right, and it's interesting because when you go through that process, the government, they're supposed to be a neutral arbitrator and look at this without bringing in religion or their personal views or anything like that, just examining the sincerity. But all of these statements are actually theological, religious statements. Oh, how could you really do that? How could you really believe this? It's assumptions that they're having about what is meaningful in my life. What's meaningful in my life is just my material life. That's the assumption they're bringing, and that disconnect, I think, is increasing. That case for Hassan went to they tried to appeal it to the European Court of Human Rights, and it was just summarily denied, even though it's such a clear violation of every piece of guidance of how you handle these things. And when you're coming at any religious freedom issues, especially in very, very difficult countries, with a purely secular mindset of, all that matters is just these sort of material things, then you're going to misunderstand so much about what's actually happening in the country, about how the victims are being victimized, about the different kinds of pressure, and about how power is being exercised in the country. So it's something that really has to be changed. And it's wonderful that there's lots of people who are trying to do that, and we just have to be louder about it.
I have a real quick question. You touched on how deeply rooted Islam is in those countries have. How realistic is it that Islam can be reformed? We hear a lot about reformation, and that's what needs to happen, but who's willing to take that risk to actually want to reform?
And I actually thought to say that was probably a deeper question, and it might maybe be better placed towards the end of the conference to get whoever other panelists on board, because I think that's such a large and far-reaching and important existential issue. Unless anyone really is eager to answer. I don't think so. All right. Yeah, please join me in